Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping straight into a really formative period of the American Revolutionary War, the Siege of Boston.
Exactly. We've pulled together some really compelling historical accounts. They detail the events as they unfolded, the strengths and weaknesses of both the American and British forces, and, the lasting impact of this first major conflict.
Yeah, and we've also got some fantastic illustrations and maps from the time, which really help visualize the strategic situation around Boston.
They absolutely do. Gives you a real sense of the terrain.
So our mission for you in this deep dive is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
We want to give you a sharp, insightful understanding of the Siege of Boston. We'll hit the key events, the challenges both sides were up against, and ultimately how this whole thing set the stage for the wider war.
Right. We're aiming for clarity, those key aha moments without getting bogged down in, every single minor detail.
Okay, so let's set the scene. What was going on before April 19th, 1775, before the siege really kicked off? What were the big tensions?
Well, the fundamental issue really was the British government imposing taxes and import duties on the colonies. The colonists argued quite strongly that since they had no representatives in Parliament, they shouldn't be taxed. No taxation without representation.
Man, famous phrase. And it wasn't just talk, was it? Things escalated. You have the Boston Tea Party, other protests.
Definitely. And the British reaction. They sent about 4,000 troops under General Thomas Gage to occupy Boston, basically to clamp down on the unrest. Imagine soldiers marching through your streets enforcing laws you never agreed to.
Must have felt like a real occupation. And Parliament didn't stop there, did they?
No, they doubled down. They actually authorized Gage to disband the Massachusetts Bay government. They saw guys like John Hancock and Samuel Adams as ringleaders, troublemakers.
Trying to cut the head off the snake, so to speak.
Pretty much. But dissolving their local government just pushed the colonists further towards organizing themselves.
And they did organize. They set up their own Massachusetts Provincial Congress, started coordinating local militias, stockpiling weapons and supplies.
Exactly. They were clearly getting ready, anticipating that things might turn violent. It was like building a parallel government, ready for a showdown.
And that British attempt to apply economic pressure, the Boston Port Act, that kind of backfired, didn't it?
Massively. Closing the port was meant to punish Boston, force them into line, but instead, it caused huge unemployment, widespread anger, not just in Boston, but across the colonies. They saw it as collective punishment. It actually strengthened resistance.
Right. Which brings us to that pivotal date, April 19th, 1775. British troops marching to Concord.
To seize those very supplies the colonists had been gathering, but they ran into trouble. Fierce resistance in Lexington, then again in Concord. It wasn't the quick raid they'd planned.
No, the battles of Lexington and Concord were a real shock to the British system. They took surprisingly heavy casualties on the retreat back to Boston.
It showed the colonial militias weren't just a disorganized mob. They could fight. They were determined. It sent a clear message.
And that resistance became a rallying cry, right? Militias from all over New England started heading towards Boston.
Immediately. Thousands of them. We even have that quote from General Gage admitting his surprise. He said, the rebels are not the despicable rabble too many have supposed them to be. He noted they showed more conduct, attention, and perseverance than they ever had against the French.
What do you think surprised him most? The organization.
I think so. The organization, the determination, these weren't professional soldiers, but they acted together. They held their ground. It showed a depth of commitment he just hadn't anticipated.
It really did.
Yes.
Okay, so shots fired, militias gathering. Let's move into the siege itself, that initial phase, April to June 75.
Right after Lexington and Concord, the Massachusetts militia basically threw up a cordon around Boston. They blocked all the land routes from Chelsea down to Roxbury, effectively trapping the British on the peninsula.
Suddenly, a major city cut off by land. Huge deal. And who was leading the Americans at this point?
Initially, it was William Heath, but things were moving fast. The Continental Congress in Philadelphia stepped in, formed the Continental Army.
And appointed Washington.
Yes, on June 15th, they appointed George Washington commander-in-chief, a huge moment. Though before he actually arrived, command on the ground fell to Artemas Ward, who took over from Heath pretty quickly, like April 20th. Shows how quickly things were escalating and organizing.
And tactically, the Americans grabbed control of those key land bridges, right?
Yeah.
Charlestown Neck and Boston Neck.
Crucial choke points. That left the British completely reliant on the harbor, on the Royal Navy for everything supplies, reinforcements, communication. Logistically, it put them in a tough spot.
And the American forces just kept growing.
Absolutely. Militias flooded in from New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Thousands of men joined the siege lines in those first weeks. It showed real widespread support across New England.
Let's get a sense of the numbers, the structure. By July 75, the British in Boston. Who were they?
You had experienced commanders arriving, Howe, Clinton, Burgoyne, joining Gage. They had organized regiments, artillery, engineers, professional army structure, and critically, the Royal Navy's North American squadron controlling the harbor.
That naval power was key, wasn't it?
Absolutely vital for the British. Resupply, troop movement, projecting force. Without the Navy, Boston would have been impossible to hold. The Americans had basically nothing to challenge them at sea initially.
And on the American side, the United Colonies Army, soon to be Washington's command.
A real mix. Artillery under Henry Knox, though not much artillery yet. Regiments from different colonies, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Even rifle companies coming up from Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia. A diverse force, but largely inexperienced compared to the British regulars.
Okay, so the British are penned in. How did they plan to defend Boston itself?
They focused on fortifying the hills within the Boston Peninsula. Easily defensible high ground, 4 key hills were quickly turned into strong points.
But they made a really interesting decision regarding Charlestown across the river.
Yes, a decision that looks like a major oversight later. Gage pulled all his troops back from Charlestown after the Concord retreat. They abandoned it completely.
Leaving places like Bunker Hill, Breed's Hill, and Dorchester Heights completely undefended.
Exactly. Dorchester Heights, especially that position, will become absolutely crucial later. Why leave them? Maybe Gage felt stretched thin, focused on Boston proper. Maybe he underestimated the Americans' ability or willingness to occupy them. A strategic miscalculation, certainly in hindsight.
Interesting. There was also that arrangement about Boston Neck, wasn't there? Civilians could come and go.
Yeah, an informal agreement, as long as you weren't carrying firearms. Apparently, Boston residents turned in nearly 2,000 muskets. Many patriots decided to leave the city. A tough choice for families.
I bet. While patriots left, loyalists outside the city were probably feeling nervous.
Definitely. With patriot militias controlling the countryside, many loyalists fled into Boston, seeking British protection. Some even formed their own units to fight for the crown. Really highlights the Civil War aspect of the Revolution.
So the Americans controlled the land, but the Royal Navy controlled the sea. Vice Admiral Graves kept supplies coming in.
He did, mostly from Nova Scotia and other loyal areas. The colonists just didn't have the ships to enforce a proper sea blockade at this point.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing for British supplies, was it?
No, not entirely. You started seeing American privateers, small armed ships, harassing British supply vessels. It wasn't stopping everything, but it was enough to drive up food prices in Boston significantly. The British actually had to introduce rationing. That must have hurt morale.
And intelligence gathering.
Yeah.
Sounds like the Americans had the upper hand there.
It seems so. They got information from people leaving Boston, people sympathetic to their cause. Gage, and the British, on the other hand, seemed to lack good intel on what the Americans were up to.
Why the difference, do you think?
Well, the colonists had the home field advantage, local networks, support. The British were occupiers, harder to gain trust. Maybe some arrogance, too, underestimating the colonists' ability to keep secrets and organize effectively.
Shows the power of local knowledge. Okay, so the siege lines are drawn. Let's talk key events, turning points in this early stage.
One of the absolute earliest and hugely significant, even though it wasn't in Boston, was the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, way up in New York. May 1775.
All right, Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen teaming up. What did they get there?
A treasure trove. Over 180 cannons, mortars, howitzers, plus other supplies. The fort was lightly defended, a relatively easy capture with massive implications.
How critical were those cannons?
Game-changing. The Continental Army was desperately short of heavy artillery at the start. Ticonderoga provided the firepower they needed to eventually challenge the British guns and, spoiler alert, force them out of Boston. It fundamentally shifted the military balance, though it took time to get the guns moved.
Closer to Boston, things weren't quiet either. Skirmishes over supplies.
Yeah, constant small actions. The British tried getting hay from Grape Island in May. Militia fired on them, burned most of the hay. Every scrap mattered.
And the Americans tried to deny resources, too, clearing islands.
Removing livestock, supplies from the harbor islands so the British couldn't get them. That led to the Battle of Chelsea Creek later in May. Royal Marines versus Americans, and the Americans actually managed to destroy a grounded British schooner, the Diana. A small win, but good for morale.
Meanwhile, British reinforcements are arriving. About 6,000 troops total by late May.
Yeah, and significantly, 3 major generals arrived on May 25th. William Howe, John Burgoyne, and Henry Clinton. Experienced commanders. Their arrival spurred the British to plan more actively to break the siege.
And their plan focused on those hills they'd abandoned.
Exactly. Fortify Bunker Hill in Charlestown and Dorchester Heights to the south. They actually set a date, June 18th, to occupy Dorchester Heights. But American intelligence got wind of it.
How?
Sources within Boston, likely. The Committee of Safety learned about the plan around June 15th.
They reacted fast.
Immediately. General Ward was ordered to fortify Bunker Hill first. Colonel William Prescott led about 1,200 men onto the Charlestown Peninsula on the night of June 16th.
And they didn't just fortify Bunker Hill itself.
No, crucially, they focused on Breed's Hill, which was closer to Boston, and offered a more commanding position. A tactical decision by the officers on the ground, seemingly. A fateful one.
Because the British saw it the next morning and reacted, leading to the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17th.
Right. Howe led the British forces in a direct assault up the hill. Incredibly bloody fighting.
The British took the hill eventually, but the cost?
Astronomical. Around 1,000 casualties killed or wounded. A huge chunk of their officer corps was hit. It was technically a British victory. They took the ground, but it was shattering.
And for the Americans?
A massive morale booster. They'd run out of ammunition, had to retreat, but they'd stood up to British regulars in a pitched battle and inflicted devastating losses. It proved they could fight.
What was the broader impact beyond the battle itself?
Psychologically huge. Shook British confidence. Made them much more cautious about direct assaults. Galvanized American resolve, probably encouraged recruitment, showed the world this wasn't just a minor rebellion.
Then came another truly pivotal moment for the Americans, July 2nd.
George Washington arrives in Cambridge, sets up headquarters, takes formal command of the Continental Army the next day.
A new phase begins. What were his immediate priorities?
Organization, discipline. Turning these disparate militia groups into something resembling a unified army, appointing officers, establishing procedures, even specifying officer insignia, trying to create structure. A massive undertaking.
And more troops were arriving, too. The riflemen.
Yes. Companies of riflemen from Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, expert marksmen with accurate rifles, unlike the standard smoothbore muskets. They became incredibly effective sharpshooters, harassing the British constantly during the stalemate that followed Bunker Hill.
So after Bunker Hill, things settled into more of a stalemate July to November.
Largely, yes. Washington focused on strengthening the siege lines, digging trenches, pushing closer to Boston Neck, but it wasn't quiet. Constant sniping, occasional skirmishes.
Any notable actions?
The Americans fired on British work parties. The British pushed back an American advance guard in late July, burned some houses in Roxbury. There was a nasty incident where the British displayed a dead rifleman's body, and the Americans retaliated with a day-long sharpshooting barrage that caused significant British casualties.
Tit for tat.
And raids, too. Yeah, the British launched a surprise sortie from Boston Neck in late August, burned a tavern. The Americans hit back that same night, raiding Lighthouse Island, destroying the lighthouse, killing some Brits, taking prisoners, constant probing, keeping the pressure on.
Washington kept pushing the defenses closer.
Always. Sent men to dig in near Charlestown Neck, even under British bombardment. He was clearly impatient, looking for a way to break the deadlock.
And he was thinking bigger, wasn't he? Quebec.
Yeah.
An attack on Boston itself.
Absolutely. By September, he was planning the invasion of Quebec. He dispatched Benedict Arnold with troops for that. And he proposed an ambitious amphibious assault across Back Bay to hit Boston directly.
But his officers weren't keen on the Boston attack.
No, the War Council shot it down unanimously. Too risky, lack of resources, approaching winter. They urged caution. Must have been frustrating for Washington.
Probably. But he did approve arming ships, the start of the Navy.
Sort of, yeah. Authorized local fishing vessels for intelligence and intercepting supply ships, a precursor to the Continental Navy, and they had successes, like capturing the British brigantine Nancy with its cargo of ordnance. Every bit helped.
Then winter sets in. Hard times for both sides.
Very hard. For the Americans, the big crisis was gunpowder. Critically low. Some soldiers literally had spears, plus pay issues, enlistments running out. Washington was struggling to hold the army together.
How did he manage?
Leadership, appeals to patriotism, trying to improve conditions where possible. The cause itself kept many going. but it was precarious.
And the British in Boston, Howe had replaced Gage by now.
Yes, Howe took command in October, and he had huge problems. Firewood was desperately scarce. They were tearing down houses, wharves, even parts of the Old North Church for fuel.
And the supply situation got worse.
Much worse. American privateers became more active, capturing dozens of British ships over the winter. Food was scarce, leading to hunger, desertion. Disease became rampant: scurvy, smallpox.
Smallpox hit the Americans too, didn't it?
It did. Washington had to set up a separate hospital, a terrible reality of 18th century life and warfare.
Despite all this, Washington still wanted to attack Boston.
Repeatedly. Proposed assaults, but his officers kept advising against it. Lack of powder, winter conditions. They felt the risk was too high.
Then the harbor froze.
Yeah, in February 76, the water between Roxbury and Boston Common froze solid. Washington seriously considered an attack across the ice. Imagine that.
But again, his council said no.
Again, they advised against it. Too vulnerable on the open ice. Washington feared his army would just melt away over the winter if they didn't act, but his officers remained cautious.
Meanwhile, the British weakened their own force. Clinton left.
Right. In mid-January, General Clinton took about 1,500 men and sailed south, trying to rally loyalists in the Carolinas, splitting their forces at a crucial time.
But the biggest development that winter, Henry Knox and the cannons.
The Noble Train of Artillery. An incredible story. Knox, a bookseller turned artillery chief, proposed going to Fort Ticonderoga and hauling those captured cannons all the way back to Boston in winter.
How on earth did they do it?
An epic feat. 60 tons of cannons and mortars, hauled on sledges pulled by oxen, across frozen rivers, over snowy mountains, hundreds of miles. Immense logistical challenges: food, repairs, weather, just sheer grit and determination.
Unbelievable. When did they finally arrive?
Knox and the cannons rolled into Cambridge on January 24th, 1776, a sight for sore eyes, you can imagine.
And that changed everything.
Fundamentally. Now, Washington had the heavy artillery needed to threaten the British positions and, critically, the ships in the harbor. It leveled the playing field.
And they put them to use quickly.
Didn't waste time, started bombarding Boston on March 2nd. The British fired back, but this was really just cover for Washington's masterstroke, which was occupying Dorchester Heights. That strategic high ground overlooking the harbor that the British had left empty for months. On the night of March 4th, 5th, under cover of their own bombardment, thousands of American troops moved onto the heights.
But the ground was frozen solid. How did they fortify it overnight?
Ingenious solution credited to Rufus Putnam. They used prefabricated defenses, heavy timbers, bundles of sticks called fascines built elsewhere, and moved into place quickly, like snapping together giant fortifications overnight.
And the British reaction the next morning?
Utter shock. General Howe reportedly said something like, "My God, these fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months." The illustration we have really shows how commanding that position was. Suddenly, American cannons looked right down on the British fleet.
So the fleet was trapped.
Vulnerable.
Completely vulnerable. The ships, the city itself. Howe's position was suddenly untenable. His supply line was threatened.
What could he do? His choices were stark. Launch a risky, potentially disastrous assault to retake the heights, another Bunker Hill, maybe worse, or evacuate Boston. A convenient storm actually delayed any immediate British attack plan.
And they chose evacuation. But there was some behind-the-scenes talk about not destroying the city.
Yes, some leading Bostonians sent feelers out, basically saying, if you leave peacefully, we won't attack you on the way out and you won't burn the city down. Washington formally rejected the letter protocol, but the message got through. A tacit understanding.
Before they left, though, more artillery fire. Nooks Hill.
Yeah, the British saw some American activity on Nooks Hill, another spot in Dorchester, and unleashed a huge barrage on March 9th. Fired about 700 cannonballs. Surprisingly little damage, though killed 4 Americans with 1 ball. The Americans apparently just collected the British cannonballs to reuse.
Resourceful. And Howe issued that strange proclamation about seizing linen and wool.
Desperate measure, trying to deny the American supplies. A loyalist named Crean Brush was put in charge, giving out worthless IOUs. Didn't exactly endear them to the remaining locals.
So the British prepared to leave. Took about a week.
Yeah, waiting for favorable winds from March 10th. Loading troops, supplies, and significantly, thousands of loyalists who feared staying behind. Meanwhile, American privateers were still snapping up supply ships outside the harbor.
And then, March 17th, 1776, St. Patrick's Day.
The wind turned favorable. Evacuation began at 4 a.m. Orders were to burn the town if the Americans interfered. By 9 a.m., the whole fleet, 120 ships, over 11,000 people, was sailing away. The painting really conveys the scale of it, a huge exodus.
And the Americans moved in.
Cautiously at first, checked Bunker Hill found only dummies left behind. Artemas Ward smartly sent in troops already exposed to smallpox first, to minimize spreading it further. The main army entered a few days later, March 20th. Boston was back in American hands.
Did Washington try to stop the fleet leaving?
Didn't hinder the land departure, but he sent Captain Manley and his ships to harass the fleet at sea. They actually captured several ships, including the one carrying Korean brush and all the goods he'd confiscated. Poetic justice.
Nice. And Howe left some ships behind to warn others. Didn't quite work.
He tried. Left a small contingent to intercept incoming British vessels and redirect them to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where the main fleet was headed. But some troop ships didn't get the message, sailed right into Boston Harbor, and were promptly captured by the Americans. An embarrassing blunder for the British.
So the British are gone, siege over. What happens next? The significance.
Well, immediately it meant the end of major fighting in New England. Washington guessed correctly that New York City would be the next target. He marched most of the army there in early April, kicking off the New York and New Jersey campaign. That Boston victory was a huge morale boost going into that next very difficult phase.
And Washington got recognition for it later.
He did. Awarded the first Congressional Gold Medal in 1790, specifically for the Boston victory, cemented its importance in the founding narrative.
How was Howe viewed back in Britain?
Critically, Sir Henry Clinton, who eventually replaced him, basically said Howe messed up by not fortifying the hills earlier. Howe faced heat in the press and Parliament. Gage, his predecessor, never got another field command. Burgoyne and Clinton, though, continued to play major roles, with, well, mixed results later in the war.
And the social impact. The Loyalists?
Huge numbers left with the British. Thousands of Massachusetts Loyalists went to Canada, England. Some eventually returned, but many never did. A real tearing of the social fabric.
But Boston itself remained important.
Absolutely. As a port for warships, privateers, a center of revolutionary thought and activity, its leaders played key roles in forming the new nation. The spirit of 75 lived on there.
And they still remember it today.
They do. March 17th is Evacuation Day in Boston and nearby towns, a local holiday. And interestingly, some current U.S. Army units actually trace their lineage back to the militia regiments that served at the siege. A direct link.
Wow, history really connecting to the present.
It does. So, wrapping up this deep dive, the Siege of Boston was a crucial early American victory, won through strategic patience, holding the siege lines, overcoming shortages, and then that decisive move onto Dorchester Heights, thanks to Washington's leadership and Knox's incredible cannon journey.
Showcased American ingenuity, resourcefulness, and determination against a professional army. But we shouldn't forget the hardships. Nearly a year's siege took a toll on both sides. Shortages, disease, the constant tension.
Absolutely. For the Americans, it was forging an army while starving for supplies. For the British, trying to hold a hostile city with a fraying supply line, it tested everyone.
And individuals really mattered. Washington's leadership, Knox's drive, their actions were pivotal.
Undeniably. Their contributions had impacts far beyond just Boston.
Which brings us to a final thought for our listeners. How did this early, maybe unexpected victory against the odds really shape the rest of the revolution? What does this deep dive tell us about strategic thinking, about perseverance when things look almost impossible? Something to chew on.
Definitely something to consider.
Join us next time for another deep dive.